Good morning, everyone. Hope everyone is doing well. We have many people over Zoom, which is great. And this talk is also being recorded in case you would like to share with other people later on or watch again. So today we are really very privileged and pleased to have our dear friend Megan Greenfield of McKinsey here with us. As you know, this is our first seminar for newly established program that we have at the Media Lab Women's Health Program, which we called WHX. X over here is sort of representing the unknown, exploration, excellence, and expansion, and many other words with X inside. Yes, why not? X chromosome, I love it. Okay. So this initiative, for which I am a lead faculty here at the Media Lab, and we are hoping to first create awareness on women's health issues that we have, which are underfunded, underexplored, undervalued. And at the same time, we would like to generate the new generation who would have bold ideas to tackle all the problems that we are facing during our daily lives, all the way from breast cancer to mental health disorders or issues or other societal problems that we face, but I mean we, the half of the population. So we are also planning to use this Women's Health Initiative to later on merge with the other amazing initiatives that we have at MIT, such as MIT Heals. Now today with us, we also have the director of MIT Heals Initiative that MIT president launched very recently, Angela Kohler. She's here. Thank you for being with us. So without taking so much of your time, I would like to give a little introduction about our amazing speaker, dear friend, Megan. She is a partner in the McKinsey's Boston office and affiliated leader of McKinsey Health Institute. And she's going to talk about two giant reports that they composed together with the other key players at the McKinsey, where you will hear tons of unknown and known points about half of the population, how we can unlock $400 billion globally in 4 years, 5 years, by just tackling on women's health-related points that she's going to raise today in her talk. She had multiple amazing other initiatives at the McKinsey, but what I would like to highlight, a couple of fun things that she had under her portfolio, is that she's a member of the board of trustees of the Museum of Science in Boston, which is amazing. I really like to see the science and museum aspect. The elegancy comes from art into the science with that hat that she has. And she's also a member of World Economic Forum Young Global Leader. So please join me to welcome Megan Greenfield.
So I'm super, super excited today. And so what we're going to talk about is closing the women's health gap. So context here is we did the McKinsey Health Institute, a collaboration with the World Economic Forum, and we launched it 3 years ago with our first seminal paper 2 years ago on closing the women's health gap. And what we realized as you look at women's health, the business case, surprisingly, despite the fact that 50% approximately of the world's population is women, was still not clear. And the business community and broader kind of other stakeholders had really not felt like they kind of got what the business case was. So we said, we're going to do this, and we're going to do it rigorously, and we're going to make sure that everyone knows what the business case is for women's health. So as I go through this, one disclaimer. So we will focus on the term women, which we're referring to cisgender women. There's not enough data for non-binary and trans women. We hope that changes, but I want to make sure to acknowledge that. So what we're going to do is bust some myths about women's health. So the first one is women live longer than men, so they must be healthier, right? No. Actually, if you look at the data, women spend 25% more time in poor health than men. 25%. That is several years of every woman's life annually. Second, well, women live longer, so maybe it's at the end of their life, right? And so it doesn't really matter. Well, actually, if you look at where the women's health gap is concentrated, it's actually in women's working years. So 60% of it is actually in women's working years. So that's what translates to the GDP opportunity that we were talking about. The next myth is women's health is sexual and reproductive health. We talked the bikini medicine, right? Historically, the focus, when you heard women's health, you think it's in the domain of an OB-GYN. But actually, you should think differently. When we're talking about doing this research, we're thinking about the health of women, not the traditional definition of women's health. And what you look at is what you traditionally think about women's health in the reproductive space, the bikini medicine. If you look at the health burden for women, that's only 5% of our burden. Not surprising. I mean, the number one killer of women is actually cardiovascular disease. It's not actually breast cancer, which many people think it is. And so when you look at this, if you look at the conditions that impact women uniquely, which is in the pink on the far left, differently, that's like cardiovascular disease, and then disproportionately, it's actually over 50%. And the rest in the gray just means we don't have sufficient evidence to really understand sex-based differences to get if there's a disparity. So my guess is this number is only going to get larger over time as we expand our understanding. So the takeaway here is women are not small men. It's really fundamental, right? As all of you, right, being researchers, I have my background in a PhD, I never thought about what the sex of my cells were. Had no idea. Did I report it in my research? No. But our cells are fundamentally different. It makes sense when you think about it, right? Those chromosomes are different, not just in your reproductive organs. Every cell has these double X. And we know now, for example, in immunology, that second X is actually not quiet. And that's often, significantly linked to autoimmune disease. But it's really interesting because this is so fundamental, but yet we don't teach it, we don't research it, we don't think about care protocols to reflect the fact that women are not small men. The next one, myth, women's health is a niche opportunity. This should be obvious because women represent 50% of the population. But if you assumed, the previous thing that men and women are kind of the same, maybe you would say, well, why should I disproportionately invest in women? But the reality is it's absolutely not the case. And I love this example around endometriosis. I don't know, how many of you know what endometriosis is? Oh, wow. Well, this is because I've got a friendly audience. I'd say the majority of people don't know what endometriosis is. I certainly didn't know this growing up. I had absolutely no idea. The prevalence is 1 in 10. It takes on average 10 years to get diagnosed. It's an extraordinarily painful condition. Women and girls miss days in school, they miss days in work. And yet, that's the same prevalence of diabetes in women, 1 in 10. Most audiences don't know endometriosis, but I can guarantee you every hand goes up when we say diabetes. And if you just look at the right-hand side, look at the pipeline. We have about, 10, 20, 30-ish kind of things in the pipeline for endometriosis. It's exciting that it's finally getting some more traction, both on the therapeutics and diagnostic space. But for diabetes, we already have really good therapies for diabetics. Really good therapies. And there's still over hundreds and hundreds and hundreds in the pipeline, right? Same incidence rate, right? And you'll see, later, this is relevant for many, many conditions that impact women differently or disproportionately. There is lots of money to be made, 1 in 10, and you could address, huge opportunity. So what does this, equate to, right? So it's over $1 trillion of global GDP. And so if you think about this and fewer health conditions so people can participate in the workforce, there's fewer early deaths, right? Increased productivity. If anyone's ever had a migraine and you want to try to actually do hard thinking work, not going to happen, right? And I think the extra piece is the next one is around caregiving. We know that women are disproportionately caregivers. So if you help women's health, you not only help that woman themselves participate, but you actually get the benefit of bringing the caregiver into the workforce as well. And so $1 trillion is a very conservative estimate, and about a third of that is here in the US. That's a lot of money. And this is just from a labor productivity lens. This doesn't take into account the money that can be made from pharma companies and medical device companies and consumer companies, companies that fill this demand. This is just in terms of labor productivity. So astronomical opportunity here. So we know the problem. And now we have a blueprint, which is what we released with the World Economic Forum in Davos this year. So we need to count women. We need to study women. We need to care for women. We need to include all women. And we need to invest. Doing all of these things will allow us to close the women's health gap. So I'll bring it to life on each of these. So as we figured out with the blueprint, the thing we wanted to do is say, how do we look at a representative set of conditions, right? So we want to make sure that this blueprint is comprehensive and really applicable to everything. So, we took 9 conditions that account for about a third of the women's health gap. This is the $400 billion that she was referencing earlier. And we looked at both health span conditions and lifespan conditions, right? Health span conditions, the goal is to add life to years. We want you to have full fulfillment years, right? And this has been coming more to the forefront, which has been exciting, more holistically around all the longevity research. It's not just about how long you live, but how healthy you live, because you want those two things to be as close as possible. And then lifespan conditions, right? Mortality, we want to prevent mortality. So endometriosis, menopause, migraine, PMS, right? Versus, some of the other, hypertensive disorders, which I'm personally, very passionate about from my own experience, cervical cancer, breast cancer, ischemic heart disease, and postpartum hemorrhage. So I'll just go through some of, the key points and data just to kind of bring it to life. So count. We all know if you don't measure something, you can't really take action because you don't know that there's a problem and you don't know to do that. It's like one of the very first things you do in any business is actually do a diagnosis, right? So if we look at these conditions and we look for clinical based guidelines and we look at what's called the Model Essential Medicines list. So this is a WHO list of basically these are the essential medicines to be available and affordable because they're crucial for conditions. They don't even exist. There are none for endometriosis and menopause. First of all, they literally don't have recommendations on these are the kind of core medicines that should be available and affordable. These are endometriosis, as we said, 1 in 10 women. Menopause, literally every woman that has, gets to, her anywhere from 40 to kind of 55-ish range goes through menopause. So we're talking half the world's population, and we don't have an approach, and we don't have, this is the essential medicines list. And then if we take that, even when you do have, the question is do we actually have the ability to track these drugs to understand how they're getting used? And that's what the shading here is that, and not surprisingly, starting with healthspan, we just don't even have information to track these things. So we don't really know what the access level is. We don't know how it's used. There's just very little information. And this just gives you a sense. And it consistently, when doing this report, we constantly have to highlight data is so bad, right? We don't look at the information, and I'll share at the end, but we actually, one of the big things coming out of this report is we developed what's called the WIT, Women's Health Impact Tracker. And we actually took all of our data, and we took all these different countries and we put it online so you can actually look at all of this stuff and finally have, at least for a subset of conditions, these conditions, a subset of countries, what are actually the numbers. But this doesn't exist. So we have a long way to go. Study women. I already told you, I just can't emphasize this enough. Women are not small men. And I would just say you need to ask this question. Every research thing, every time you talk about it, are you designing the medical device? Because our bodies are structured differently. Everything is different, but we don't study it like that. So I was alluding to this when you're looking at the endometriosis versus diabetes. But what we did is we looked at research funding relative to the burden. So that's using DALYs, or disability adjusted life years. And so what you can see on the far left is conditions affecting women uniquely, and then the right is conditions affect women at a higher rate, but disproportionately. So you can just see PMS, menopause. There's just very little, right, funding that goes into these things, right? Again, health span conditions, and it's a woman, you're in a tough spot. Then if you look at conditions that affect both sexes, but disproportionately impact men versus women, so migraine, it's 2 to 3x more for women, and cirrhosis is the other way around. It's more impact for men. And you can just see, and you see this, this is just an example, a trend is that conditions that impact men disproportionately versus women, you see this gap, right, if you adjust it by disability-adjusted life years. And then we talked about the endometriosis example, right? We know that diabetes is, everyone knows what it is, and everyone's investing in it. Yet we still are struggling with endometriosis. So there's a long way to go. I think the other thing that's interesting here, when do you think clinical trials were required to have women included in them in the US? What decade? So you know the answer. We've had this conversation, but 1993. 1993. Just think. That was in my lifetime. It's crazy, right? So just understand, we weren't even included in the research. And that doesn't even mean that we flipped a switch and all of a sudden we're equally represented. No, we still have a long way to go, right? So I think 1993. In addition, we need to actually then sex disaggregate the trial. So it's fine if you're included, but if you don't sex disaggregate the data, well, you're just going to have potentially different impacts and then you neutral out. So 50% of the clinical trials that we looked at in our first paper don't even report sex disaggregated data. But if you look at the ones that do, over 60% of them have worse outcomes for women, 10% for men. Not surprising, but those are the ones that actually dared to report the information, right? So those are not even the worst offenders likely, but 50% didn't even do the research and didn't sex disaggregate, whether it's power or they, whatever enrollments. But that's powerful, and that's consistent with what we see and the removals from, drugs from the market. The adverse events way disproportionately are because they happen in women. There's an Ambien story. I don't know how many are familiar with the Ambien story. So Ambien drug, sleep, right? So it kind of makes you groggy, whatever, you go to sleep. But they had a certain dose. And it turns out that a lot of women were getting really hurt. They were getting in car accidents because they were drugged, essentially. And what they realized, women degrade the drug differently. It's actually the same thing. Most people think that alcohol, the difference is because, we're smaller, we're small men. No, it's actually because the enzyme acts differently in women, and so we get a much higher dose of alcohol in our bloodstream. Same thing. And so they actually changed. It's one of the few drugs that actually has sex-specific dosing. It's 50%. Probably every drug should have this, right? It's not just about weight. There's fundamental differences in our biology and how we process drugs that have an impact. And this is one of the ways, you would think that women would be more adherent, for example, on drugs. But it's actually not the case in many cases. But one of the reasons is we have worse side effects because they weren't ever tested on us. So we've got to really make sure that we study because we'll make better drugs that are well tolerated. And there's going to be drugs that are going to be better for men and there's going to be drugs better for women. It's actually good for both. It's not just for women because if you have that negating, if you have a drug that's really good for men and bad for women and you just combine them, you may not have statistical significance, right? So it's good for both, right? And you can imagine a world where we have drugs that are disproportionately good for women and disproportionately good for men, and that's just fine. I mean, we do this with rare disease, like you look at genetic differences. Why not think about sex, which is probably the most fundamental driver of differences in our biology, but yet we, for some reason, ignore it. Care for women. So the standard of care is missing. One, we haven't studied it. I'll talk about clinical practice guidelines here, but that I also want to make it real just in terms of, life. So we looked at 15 countries in this specific blueprint, the 9 conditions that I highlighted earlier, and only 8% of the clinical practice guidelines for these conditions for these countries actually met best in class. So we worked with expert groups for each of these conditions to define what best in class in terms of is there, sex-specific dosing for drugs, care pathways, diagnosis, et cetera. So there isn't even a best practice. Like as we talked about earlier with the essential medicines list, there isn't even a best practice. So even if you as a physician or clinician want to deliver, there isn't even a clinical practice guideline available that's really kind of got the level of nuance. So we need to actually build this foundation. Part of it is because we don't have the research, but part of it is we just haven't made it a priority. The other thing is to think about caring for women. I use this example, like every time I give this talk, I wear this one ring, and it's because my grandmother, it's the one thing I have for my grandmother. She died of a sudden heart attack when I was in high school. There's no history, no diagnosis of heart disease. But the reason why? Because it was a man's disease. And women weren't supposed to get it. So, I found a piece of paper, like, on her bedside, and it was listing off she had gone to the doctor, right? And, there was a checklist. And they decided that she had depression. She had fatigue, she was tired. These are all classic symptoms of heart disease. Dismissed. No way there could be any heart disease, right? Even today, and I would say heart disease is where we've had the most movement and sort of understanding that women and men present differently, because the AHA did a big effort to try to make women aware that the way a women heart attack is also, it manifests very differently than stabbing in your chest, which most people see like in the movies and what you hear about. Still, women are twice as likely to die of a heart attack. Because the way that they present is very differently. You can just feel really bad, indigestion. It tends to be less of a intense, but more of a diffuse pain. It's hard to explain. My mom just actually had this, and I was literally talking on the phone to the PA, and I was like, you better admit her and you better talk to it. But it's very unclear. It can be very subtle. And they get dismissed. Oh, you're just making it up. You're just having your anxiety attack. It's not anything serious. They get sent home and they die. We have a long way to go. And this is one of the areas what I would say we're the most furthest along. So we have a long way to do to change care protocols and educate. Because most people never get educated. All the textbooks. They don't talk about sex differences. They don't get taught. We looked at a recent thing, it's a third of OB-GYN didn't have a session on menopause. OB-GYN, they only serve women. And they don't have a thing on menopause. And menopause is 50% of your life. People think of menopause as when you're old. It's not. It starts in your usually mid-40s, you officially get to menopause. Because perimenopause, by the way, it's like a decade. People think it's this one event. That's when, yes, there's you look back, you're like, okay, yeah, I haven't had any periods anymore. That's average is 52. But it's a decade. And if you're a Black woman, God forbid, you might have it for 15 years and start in your late 30s. They don't have classes on menopause. And fundamentally, the menopausal body is completely different than the premenopausal body, which is when you look at cardiovascular disease, estrogen is cardioprotective. We published a paper last year with the American Heart Association. It's terrifying. But you hit menopause, your cardiovascular disease risk just shoots off like a rocket ship. Exponential increase, right? But yet we're not aware and managing this, right? And it impacts everything. It's not just your heart, it's your bones. Literally, because, we talked about every cell in your body. So literally every system, it messes with your brain. You've got the brain fog. You've got all of your glands have issues with lubrication. It literally impacts everything. And we don't teach people. We don't teach people this information. God forbid we teach them male and female differences, but then you take someone's half the life, which is a whole nother piece, and we don't teach it. So we have a long way to go. One of my aspirations is we should just make sure this is all in up-to-date. I don't know if you're familiar with up-to-date, but it's what basically every physician uses to see what the protocols are. I think there should be a requirement that everything has sex-specific, cutoffs, everything. And just imagine if we could just implement that in a few years, right, that would be available. So that's one of my wish lists in case anyone has any connections. So include women, right? This is obvious, but so important. I took here a US example. We look at white and non-white women. Mortality rates, right, significantly higher in non-white women across everything, right? And there's a mix of many different factors going on. I'll be honest, we don't really understand fully. There's a matter of access, there's affordability, there is a lot of bias, for example, in minimizing pain. There's a lot of different things that going in here. But we need to understand it and we need to address it. And we shouldn't be saying, well, it's okay. No. We need to address it. One of the examples I like is I was talking in Singapore in October. I was meeting with an OB-GYN, the dean of the medical school there, and it was really interesting because we're talking about his research in the Asian population in Singapore. So gestational diabetes, right? So context, those of you who have been, probably not many, to have, when you when you are pregnant in the US, like you get, you drink some super sugary water and they measure your blood sugar, right? It's disgusting, but you force it down and they track it. But the challenge, seeing some good nods of affirmation, and to see, how your body responds, because gestational diabetes is a really important, it's a risk factor for pregnancy. But it's generally thought of like a short-term thing, right? And it's, it doesn't have impact. But it was interesting. So in Singapore, what used to be the protocol is that they would only identify, at-risk women. So disproportionately, it affects women that are more overweight, for example. And what he found, so he was doing research, and he sort of anecdotally found this, or I don't say anecdotally, but sort of by accident found the impact is that in Singapore, they were using these Western standards of like overweight to decide who actually gets the, the sugary test, and found they just were testing everyone, and they found a huge greater percentage of women were actually having gestational diabetes. It was like 25%. It was crazy high, and it wasn't correlated. And part of it is because actually the way that we, like Asian, for example, biology, like they just store fat differently. There's different risk factors. And so it's 25%. And they found that the rate of type 2 diabetes was really high, even 5 years. So, these are women that are like average in their 20s. And like 5 years later, they're actually getting type 2 diabetes. And so it was really powerful because it was about how do we think not only about race, right, in the more what we think about here in the US context, right, but actually just like geographical different, like there's very different fundamental biology that's underlying that. And you have to make sure that we get that variation in our sample set, because now, thankfully to the work, like Singapore now tests every woman and also does a lot of work on follow-up because they realize that it's such a risk factor. And this is the case, same thing for like preeclampsia and the hypertensive disorders, which I suffered through and I'm a walking advocate for, because I got discharged from MGH. Did anyone tell me anything? When you have preeclampsia, you are at dramatically higher risk of every bad thing you can imagine when it comes to your heart. It's literally a test on your body. And so if you fail, which I did 3 times, you're in trouble. No one said anything. No one said what the protocol was, nothing. I went and got myself a stress test because I was like, I know this stuff, but like, no one else is getting that treatment, which is really sad. So the last one here is invest in women. It's interesting because you take from a healthcare system perspective, women actually are a really important stakeholder. They make 80% of the healthcare decisions. If you think about it, they make the decisions for themselves, and there's a big part, right, of that is because they have, a big event, usually when they have, childbirth. They make the decisions for their kids. They usually make the decisions on where to go for their spouses or partners, and they usually make the decisions for their elder people. They literally make decisions for 3 generations of people. So as we think about women's health, if we can have a good experience for women's health, like it's going to be not only good for, the community, but like you're going to make good money. If you get loyal customers that are making all the decisions, like it's really, really important. But despite this, and this is more of a life science view, is just continued undervaluation, right, of healthcare companies. Part of there's a lot of different reasons, right? Part of it is this 1993 number, right? It is riskier. When you don't understand the uterus very well, the ovaries very well, it is a little bit riskier than going into the prostate, right? There's less of ecosystem. And disproportionately, women's health companies are women founders. And we know it's like something like 1 or 2% of like the VC funding goes to women founders, right? It's a very, very tough environment. So you take this all together, and there's real impact. But I think the exciting part is there's huge market opportunity, and there's not that much competition. So if you can find an innovation, as all of you I aspire to hope to see, on the headlines going forward, there's huge opportunity there. But we do need support and investment, especially from the big-time investors. We've got a lot of seed stuff now, and partly it's just the life cycle, but we really need to get to those big scale expansions, whether it's, your phase 3 clinical trials or whether it's scaling an intervention that works well in one area, but being able to scale it, across the US, globally, et cetera. So in short, count women, study women, care for women, include all women, and invest in women. And for your reference, in case you want to take, these are the key reports, so they're easy to find. First one is the Closing Women's Health Gap, which is our signature paper that's been exciting to really see as being the seminal paper in women's health on the business case. The Bridging the Women's Health Gap, a country-level exploration. So that is actually taking that data and you can look at different countries and see what the numbers look like. And then the blueprint is the one we published in January. And then the WIT platform, which I was talking about, is where it really goes into these 6 countries, these specific conditions and countries. And you can see in a granular level what the criteria were and how the different countries were rated. So thank you, and hopefully you're jazzed up about women's health.
This was amazing. I'm sure we all learned a lot of things today. Do you have any questions for Megan? Some time to answer, respond.
Mm-hmm. Good question. I mean, I am very passionate about endometriosis. I know you have some of the signature, like Linda Griffith here. I'm going to be speaking on one of her sessions in a few weeks. I think that one is particularly, really exciting. I think the good news is hopefully there's some stuff. There are the challenges. We have diagnosis and therapeutic challenges. I mean, I'm not as deep on that, but I think there, a lot of it is the sex, like, disaggregation stuff. Like, it's what's interesting to me is there was a story, so one of my, Lucy, who you know, like, we're having this conversation with a head of pharma R&D, right? Like, very senior, very large company. And, like, they have a huge immunology business. They don't think of themselves as a women's health company. But you think about it, actually 70 to 80% of your patients when you're in autoimmune diseases are actually women. And it was interesting just talking about it, and it was like the light bulb went off, and it was like, that XX actually matters, right? And if you change your mindset that actually, sex actually plays a major role, like, the research can change, right? And that's where you've seen the publications coming out about it's not silent X and all of these things that, which is interesting. So I love really thinking why, right? Because it's so obvious. Like, I test this whenever I go to see a physician of any sort. I'm always like, so what's the prevalence of blah, blah, blah? And it's all, male versus female, and there's always a difference. And I ask why. It is, and I'm like, well, there's probably a reason, right? There could be an access thing, but a lot of times it's because the biology is different. So I think, to me, the biggest thing is just, like, make sure, if you think about your rat models, your cell models, your representation, like, make the extra effort to do the sex disaggregation. To me, that's the most important. Is, like, the innovation is great, but just make sure we do it in a way we're actually getting the data. Because we're talking about AI. Like, I think AI is great. But guess what AI is built off? All this data that doesn't include sex disaggregated data. So you are just getting an answer that happens to be referenced in whatever the literature, which mostly doesn't include, or at least sex disaggregate women. And sometimes you see fundamentally different effects. But yeah, if you're interested, there's a book called Sex Matters that I absolutely love by Alyssa McGregor. And it goes system by system and explains the biological differences between men and women. And I think it's a really great guide because, like, oh my gosh, right? Like, just how fundamentally different it is. But I also think there's a lot of system stuff. Like, I think things that, gynecological procedures are reimbursed less than urology procedures, right? So there's a lot of, like, systems. I mean, that would be my magic wand, I think, is thinking, same thing with care providers. How do we re-educate? I mean, that's why I like the up-to-date. Like, how can we immediately get into continuing medical education and educate people? Because they weren't trained on it, right? And how do you educate? And then how do we empower us, women? We were also not taught that there was differences. I mean, everyone complains that they weren't listened to, that it took a long time to get a diagnosis, but people don't realize kind of the underlying reasons and how do you empower people to do it. And that's why the book goes, and it actually gives you the cheat sheet of things to do, which I think was really, really helpful. Yeah. Other questions? Yes. Yeah. Yeah, no, I think I would take the advice of this Singaporean dean that I had, right? He's a man. And he said, this is not about feminism. This is about biology. This is about care, health. And so it was actually very interesting, right? I think there's an element of, you're just trying to care for the population, right? It is a biological difference, which I think it's, just is straightforward. For us, I mean, I think, to be honest, you have to, depending on sort of what the person's coming from, but like, that's why we're focusing on the business case, right? It's not about warm and fuzzies. Like, yes, I care very deeply about this cause on every level, but there's a lot of money to be made. There's a lot of positive impact. What's nice is it's like the triple bottom line, right? You can, have a great, amazing impact, right, on individuals. You can have an amazing impact on enabling from a GDP, labor productivity perspective. And you can have these institutions, whether it's insurance companies, providers, pharmaceutical companies, medical device, they also can make a lot. So like literally everyone can benefit. And so I think that's the thing we anchor on is there's such opportunity to be made. This is not a political thing. It is just literally you can make great impact and you can, there's a clear business case. Yeah. Yeah, they do. Yeah, and yeah. And I mean, the way we look at it, right, is it's an and, right? Like the challenge is historically the literature has only looked at mortality, right, as the focus, right? And that is where disproportionately, right, a lot of these, horsemen. But I mean, you take heart disease. Yes, they die earlier because we do have this biological difference of we have estrogen, and so it's cardioprotective. But it's still the number one cause of death for both men and women. It's just a little bit shifted because of estrogen. So I think it's an and, right? Like we absolutely need to continue, right, doing all these things. They impact women too. It's not like they don't impact. But we have this like gaping hole here for 50% of our population where they're getting sick, they're unable to fully participate in the workforce. So it's very much an and. And that's why I like the clinical trial example. If we sex disaggregate the data, it's good for both sexes, right? Because you see this, the whole point is we're biologically different. And so when you look at the differences, you're going to see whether a drug is better for one or the other. And there may be drugs that didn't get approved, and we see this 10% is better for men. But we don't, you don't see that in all these other things. So there may be stuff that maybe in the future we'd have drugs that can be approved just for men. And that's okay. But right now we're just, you see this too with, clinical care, right? I think more recently the AHA has added more specifics on male versus female, but a lot of, when you go, like when I go to MGH, right, and I look on my EMR, patient gateway, like there's only two numbers, a low and a high. There's no like, oh, if you're a female, like, right, it's a different number. But there's time and time again, we know that actually if you do that, there's men that you're not catching, and you know that there's women that you're not catching, right? So it helps both populations by sex disaggregating. And so I think we have to make sure it's not a or, it's an and. But we have a lot of work to catch up on the data side. And think, health span, right? Historically, health span was not a thing, right? And women, historically, just from a cultural society, were not very vocal about it because, frankly, they were also dismissed. And if you haven't been through, intense, very painful periods, like hard to understand how bad it is. You can say, the whole concept of hysterical, if you know the history of the term hysterical, it's the roving uterus. It's like, basically, if you couldn't understand it, we just sort of made up a term for it. So I think, anyways, and And I would say definitely make the business case, but it's good for everyone. And I would also just say from a personal side, every time I talk to men about this, I have never had a time where they don't have a wife, a child, a mother that's really impacted by one of these conditions. Almost all of them I find they either have endometriosis, they're going through really bad menopause, they have an autoimmune disease, they have really bad migraines. It is very quick that I can find a condition, and they're like, oh, I didn't realize that's women's health. I'm like, yeah. The reason why they're suffering and they don't get the treatment that may be as good as you would like is because we haven't studied it. And then all of a sudden, it's a very different conversation. Other questions? Oh. I know. It's expensive, right? It's a power issue, right? And so I think it's recommended by the FDA. I think everyone's hopeful that it will become, I mean, if I had a magic wand, that's what I would say, is that going forward, I have to give some lag time for the studies that are already underway, but I think that should just be a requirement. And it should be required that you have a enrollment that is relevant to the epidemiology of your disease, right? I think if you got those two things, and including age, right? Like cardiovascular disease is one of my examples, right? The people that die with heart disease that are women are menopausal women. But it's only 26% of the last decade or so of cardiovascular disease where we really understand this are actually enrolled in the clinical trials, right? So even today, even if you get we have 40%, I think approximately, representation, it's getting there. We're still not doing that subsegment that actually is the one that we really need to understand, because that's where we need the drug, right? We need the drug in the people that are actually have this skyrocketing risk of cardiovascular disease. But that's where all of you come into play, right? You need to ask the question, right? I mean, there's people that's what we need, is people to say, we need to understand this. And there is a benefit, to doing this. If you understand that, you have a differentiated value prop. There's a lot of parts. I mean, immunology is a good example. There's a lot of competition. But if you can say, well, my thing is exceptionally good at women and something else is not, that can be a differentiator, right? But if you don't even have the data, how do you tell? So, but it's expensive, right? I mean, that's why regulation is one of the things where everyone steps up will be valuable if that can be implemented and enforced. Yeah, one more. All right. Yeah, so I mean, it depends on what thing. I mean, I like to read books. So I mentioned Sex Matters. I think there's a whole series like that. All in Your Head just got published. There's another one. So I find those are great, primers. I mean, my paper is a little bit intense, but shared, if, depending on kind of the audience, I think that those are good. There's a lot of stuff, and I'm happy to, I can send things, but there's a lot of information about this. I mean, this is literally why I do what I do, why I'm here, why, I'm doing the same thing, a major venture capital firm this afternoon, is education, right? Because if I can educate you, and if I can say, if you can talk to your family, if you can talk to your friends, that would be my ask for each of you, right? Have this conversation. Guess what I learned today, and share it, right? We can get movement, right? Share it on LinkedIn, share it on Facebook. Have the conversation, right? Because literally you will save someone's life by doing this. And at the worst, you're going to make them feel more validated about their experience and more confident to ask questions of their physician, which can have a huge impact. But I think there's several books, there's podcasts. 2 weeks ago, I was actually in Chicago with Halle Berry. She's doing a big thing on menopause. So menopause, for example, she's Respin as a company. So there's resources that she's been, putting together, and just making it real. She did a podcast on her own experience about menopause, where she got completely misdiagnosed and had absolutely no prep. And, her thing was if I can get menopause therapy and I have literally everything at my disposal, how can anyone else? So there's a lot of those things that I think are helpful, because it just makes it real, and brings it down to a non-kind of medical scientific world. But the key is just talk about it. Talk about it. Use the words. talk about women's health, talk about menopause, endometriosis, et cetera, menstrual health. Amazing. Well, thank you. So I hope that you will all go have these conversations. So I really appreciate it. And yeah, hope we can stay connected.
Thank you so much, Megan, for this eye and mind-opening presentation. I think we all learned a lot. So when you see a person at a speaker setting, you only see one dimension of the individual. I also would like to acknowledge and say Megan is a multi-dimensional, multi-function individual. She's also a mom of two. And this morning we stole some hours from her children as a thank you. We had some little gifts for the babies. I hope they enjoy. And on top of it, I met Megan around, I think, a few months ago. And sometimes when you met a person, you had a feeling like you know as if for several years. So I felt that way. So I also would like to thank her for her friendship and for her service and amazing work that they do for all of us, and especially for this impactful and fabulous talk that she gave this morning. And thank you all for coming and joining us. This is our first seminar supported by the Women's Health Program, MAS, and Conformable Decoders Group at the Media Lab. And we will have many more in coming months, so please tune. Thank you.